The night at Hard Rock Stadium is cloaked in the pale blue glow of fading floodlights. The entire city of Miami seems to hold its breath as the name Dan Marino echoes through the loudspeaker, warm yet sacred. On the giant screen, images of him at his peak flicker to life, his arm launching the ball like lightning, its perfect spiral trajectory tearing through Florida's humid air. 61,361 yards, 420 touchdowns, 9 Pro Bowls, MVP in 1984, Hall of Fame in 2005, numbers that don't just speak of talent, but stand as proof of a generation shaped by him. Marino wasn't just the heart of the Miami Dolphins, he was the soul of an entire city. A poor kid from Pittsburgh who rose to the pinnacle of the NFL, turning jersey number 13 into a sacred symbol no player dares to wear again. They say he turned football into art, transforming passes into a symphony of courage. But tonight, amid the silent stands, that glory becomes a mirror reflecting the loneliness of a legend who never fulfilled his destiny. Darkness slowly envelops the field, with only a spotlight illuminating the #13 jersey hanging in midair. Marino bows his head, his deep eyes seeming to hold a weary sky. He once threw for the world, but the Super Bowl ring never came back to his hand. In 1993, the sharp crack of a torn Achilles rang out like the sound of fate. His body in pain, his spirit drained, yet he returned to the field, throwing through agony and doubt. At 64, as the stadium lights dim, he no longer needs the crowd to prove anything. He has lived, fallen, and stood tall. The announcer's voice rises, soft but piercing. He once made all of America cheer, but now only the wind brings the question. Dan Marino, the greatest who never won, has he found peace? Miami's night grows heavy, and in that stillness, America seems to be bidding farewell to a piece of its own heart. Pittsburgh, the 1960s. A city of steel, sweat, and industrial train whistles. Mornings in Oakland always began with thick fog, mingled with the smell of smoke from factories still aglow. Amid this scene, a scrawny boy named Dan Marino carried a tattered bag, throwing an old rubber ball against the brick wall behind his house. Each throw echoed through the frigid air like a knock on the door of a dream no one believed in. His father, Daniel Sr., drove a delivery truck for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Every morning, as his father prepared to leave, Dan stood on the porch, waiting for him to look back. But most times he left only the sound of the engine and a trail of white exhaust. His father loved him in the way of a working-class generation, silently, sternly, sparing in praise. His mother, Veronica, a kind Polish woman, was always busy, carrying the weight of their small home. The family was poor, but in her eyes, faith remained, faith that her eldest son would do something different, would step out of this smoky steel city. Those years, Pittsburgh wasn't a place for dreamers. It taught endurance, not aspiration. While other kids slept in, Dan woke early, practicing throws in the gray fog. His hands numb, knees scraped. Each throw was a reminder he would go further than this place. He wasn't the son his father hugged after victories. When Dan brought home an honor roll certificate from Central Catholic, his father only nodded. Good. No smile, no "I'm proud of you." That night, Dan lay still, raw with emptiness. And perhaps that silence carved a vow in him. If his father wouldn't say he was proud, he'd make the whole world say it instead. Central Catholic wasn't easy for a working-class Pittsburgh kid. Friends laughed when he spoke of playing in the NFL. "Here people work in factories, not on TV," a teacher once said. But Dan didn't argue. He just threw harder longer, until his shoulder ached. His coach recalled, "Some mornings the fog was so thick, I couldn't see the ball, only heard it hit the wall, steady, for hours." That sharp sound would later become the heartbeat of his game on the field. The Steel City forged his stubbornness and resilience, but it also planted a wordless loneliness in his heart. At home, his father rarely showed emotion. He taught his son that men don't cry. Once after a loss, Dan came home with red eyes, and his father only said, "If you cry, you'll lose again." Those words, seemingly harsh, left a scar on Dan's soul. From then on, he hid his tears, letting sorrow fuel stronger, farther, more precise throws. He grew up between two worlds, a relentless city, and a dream no one believed in. Passing smoky streets, Dan saw men returning home with soot-blackened hands, too tired to look up. He knew that staying meant becoming one of them, so he threw to escape, as if each spiral could open another door. No one saw that behind his fierce gaze was a kid longing for a single word of praise. At 16, Dan started getting noticed. College scouts watched him play, his 60-yard throws igniting the stands. His father sat on the bleachers, silent. After the game, he only placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing lightly. That was the closest Dan came to recognition, not in words, but in silence. Yet in his heart, a whisper persisted. When Dad doesn't say I'm proud, I'll throw so the whole world sees. And so, the Pittsburgh kid hurled himself into a path of no return, where each throw was a brush with destiny, where stadium lights slowly replaced the embraces stolen from his childhood. The Steel City forged the NFL's strongest arm, but left cracks that never healed. In the whistle of Pittsburgh's winds, they say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of a ball bouncing off old brick walls, the sound of a boy trying to prove that sometimes love must be thrown far to reach another's heart. When he entered the University of Pittsburgh in 1979, Dan Marino carried a simple dream to play football, to prove to his father and his city that he could be someone. But fate is never simple for those born in adversity. In his freshman year with the Pitt Panthers, the curly-haired rookie from Oakland stunned the NCAA. That arm, fast, strong, precise, seemed made to defy physics. Commentators called Marino the steel wind from Pittsburgh, while fans chanted his name as if they'd glimpsed the future. In a city once shrouded in factory smoke, people began to smile at their TVs. One of their own was making America talk about Pittsburgh not just for steel, but for dreams. Marino played football with instinct and emotion. No flair, no calculation, just a blend of hometown grit and a lightning-fast mind. Coach Jackie Sherrill once said, he could read defenses like others read poetry. 4 seasons at Pitt, Marino led the team to dazzling victories, comebacks that drove fans wild. They called him the Golden Arm of Pennsylvania. Local papers printed photos of him beaming, arms raised, like a young saint. But behind those images were snowy nights on an empty stadium field, with only a college kid sitting alone in the locker room, staring at hands purple from cold. Early glory always comes at a cost. In 1982, the Pitt Panthers were expected to contend for a national championship. Marino, already a star, entered the season as if destined to win. NFL scouts praised him, reporters hounded him, students shouted his name across campus. But in his own mind, a darker shadow grew, the fear of being forgotten. He began to fear the praise, the cheers, because they were like fire, warm up close but scorching if held too long. The final game of that season, Pitt lost painfully. Marino threw a decisive interception, and the championship dream dissolved like sea foam. Leaving the field, he said nothing. Reporters swarmed, asking how he felt. He only whispered, "Not good enough." That simple, haunting answer became the verdict he imposed on himself for the rest of his life. While teammates partied to celebrate the school year, Marino stayed in the film room, watching that errant throw dozens of times. A senior, hunched before a flickering screen, eyes glued to a ball cut short in midair, and he wondered, what if I'm not good enough? What if my whole life is just the guy who almost reached the top? That night, snow fell outside the window, blanketing the steps of Heinz Field. Marino opened the door and stepped out, breathing deeply into the frigid air. Pittsburgh lay silent. The city that had once been harsh to the Steeltown boy, now reflected streetlight glow onto the sweat-drenched face of a man learning to face his own fears. In that moment, he understood, talent is a gift, but also a curse, for it allows no peace. In his final college year, Marino was named All-American. Experts ranked him among the top 5 quarterback prospects for the NFL, but the praise increasingly exhausted him. He feared each clap was another stone tied to his feet, dragging him down if he failed. Friends recalled, Dan never went to victory parties. After every game he'd go to the film room, watching tapes, silent for hours. At 21, He already knew the feeling of standing on the edge between glory and the abyss. When the season ended, Marino was awarded Player of the Year, but his smile was strained. At the ceremony, his father sat in the audience, watching his son receive the medal. When it was over, Dan approached him, and his father only said, "Good job," nothing more. Marino smiled, nodded, but his heart felt heavy as stone. He longed for something more, perhaps an "I'm proud of you," but it never came. And perhaps in that silent moment, he decided, if no one would say it, he'd make the world acknowledge him. That evening, while signing autographs for a group of young students, a boy asked, "Are you afraid of losing?" Marino smiled, his gaze distant. "You're allowed to hurt when you lose, but you're not allowed to stop." Those simple words foreshadowed his entire life, a life that would endure countless falls but never surrender. Pittsburgh, the city that once forged steel for America, had now forged a man of steel, resilient on the outside, fractured within. As his final winter at Pitt drew to a close, Dan Marino left the field with his hands deep in his coat pockets, wind tussling his hair, snow blanketed the stands, and in that cold no one knew the young student was stepping out of childhood into destiny. A destiny brilliant yet cruel, where talent would become both glory and burden, where applause would forever echo a question without an answer. How much is enough to make his father, the world, and himself believe he was worthy? April 1983. New York City buzzed with draft day, the event millions of fans awaited, where dreams were priced in minutes. The press called it the QB class of the century, the greatest quarterback class ever. John Elway, Jim Kelly, Tony Eason, Ken O'Brien, Todd Blackledge, and a kid from Pittsburgh, Dan Marino. He arrived in Manhattan in a deep blue suit, hair neatly combed, carrying hope and fear. Experts ranked him top 5, some saying, Marino's arm could change a franchise. But backstage whispers spread, rumors of arrogance, a reckless lifestyle, claims he smoked pot in college. Marino didn't know the source, but he understood in this world, sometimes doubt alone was enough to kill a dream. Elway's name was called first, then Todd Blackledge, then Jim Kelly. Marino sat still, hands clenched. With each name announced, cameras panned to his face, still that smile, but his eyes darkened. By the 6th pick, his name hadn't been called. The hands that had thrown thousands of yards now gripped the table's edge. A reporter asked, "Why haven't you been picked?" Marino replied curtly, "Guess I'm not good enough." The words were like a knife to his own pride. Then at pick 27, the Miami Dolphins called Dan Marino's name, not with cheers, but with the calm voice of Coach Don Shula over the phone. "We're giving you a shot. The rest is up to you." No fanfare, no embraces, just a cold acknowledgement. He was chosen. But as a consolation, even Shula later admitted, "It's hard to believe he lasted to 27. But when everyone doubted him, I wanted to see if they were wrong." That night, in a small Manhattan hotel, Marino didn't eat or speak. He sat alone before a blank TV, staring at his hands. The hands that had sent balls soaring through countless skies now trembled slightly. In his mind, the whispers echoed, "He's arrogant, unreliable, not disciplined enough." Everything he believed in, hard work, talent, records, suddenly felt meaningless. His father called, voice gruff, "You got picked, that's enough." But Marino stayed silent. In the room's yellow light, his eyes gleamed, not with joy, but with a smoldering fire. He whispered, as if vowing to himself, "They'll regret doubting me." The next day he flew to Florida. The air was warmer, but his heart was cold as steel. At his first press conference, a reporter asked, "How do you feel about 26 teams passing on you?" Marino smiled, "I'll make those 26 teams remember their mistake." The words silenced the room. They saw in his eyes not arrogance, but restrained fury, the anger of someone labeled good enough, but not clean enough. In his early days in Miami, he spoke little. He trained relentlessly, studied the playbook late into the night, threw until his hands bled. Teammates recalled, Marino came first, left last. He didn't smile, just threw. Each spiral was a rebuttal, each yard gained a wound stitching itself shut. Shula watched, and in silence, knew he'd chosen right. I saw in his eyes, not the light of talent, but the darkness of someone humiliated, Shula said. And sometimes that darkness makes a champion. But to turn humiliation into glory, Marino paid with loneliness. He bonded with no one. In the locker room, he sat at the far end, earphones in, reviewing tapes, meticulously noting every errant throw. In a later interview, Marino confessed, "I wasn't afraid of failing, I was afraid of being what they thought I was." That explained it all, the obsession with perfection, the coldness, the eyes that never looked up when praised. When preseason began, Miami expected little, but within a few games, they saw something extraordinary. The ball left Marino's hand so fast defenses couldn't react. That arm spoke for all the words he couldn't say on draft night. Each pinpoint throw drew cheers, but he'd just turn away. To him every pass wasn't joy, but an indictment of the 26 teams that turned their backs. "I don't need their forgiveness," he said. "I need them to remember." By the end of his rookie season, Marino shattered records, becoming the first young QB to lead the Dolphins to the playoffs. The press scrambled to change their tune. Marino, the misunderstood kid. But he didn't care. When a reporter asked how it felt to be vindicated, he replied softly, "No one ever apologized, so why should I feel vindicated?" A wound can scar over, but humiliation doesn't. It became the fuel for a 17-year career, the fire that drove him to throw until his shoulder ached. Deep down that night in 1983, the night he stared at his hands in a silent room, shaped everything. It was the night Dan Marino died as a naive Pittsburgh boy, and was reborn as a warrior wielding resentment as a weapon. A public wound turned into a ruthless engine, and from that humiliation, a legend was forged in steel, sweat, and wounded pride that never faded. In the fall of 1984, just a year after that humiliating draft night, Dan Marino turned that resentment into a blazing fire that consumed the league. At 23, he wasn't just a talented young player, he was a phenomenon. At the Orange Bowl, where Florida's sun scorched the turf, every throw from Marino left the crowd breathless. His arm launched the ball so fast that commentators described it as a bolt of lightning piercing the tropical sky. All of America looked up, kids in schoolyards mimicking his throwing form, elbow straight, wrist snapped, releasing the ball with both fury and faith. That season, Dan Marino threw for 5,084 yards and 48 touchdowns, shattering every existing record. The Miami Dolphins won 14 straight games. He became the youngest player in history to be named NFL MVP, a new icon of modern football. The press dubbed him the Miami Miracle, Dan the Man, golden arm of the NFL. TV screens showed him striding onto the field in golden light, arms raised, a proud smile on his lips. America rejoiced, a new star was born. But in that light, Marino felt something cold. Each night after practice, while teammates celebrated, he stayed on the field alone, sitting on a bench, staring at darkened stands. The glow of fame couldn't warm the man living within it. "If this is the peak," he wrote in his notebook, "then everything after is just a descent." The words were short, sharp, but etched into his mind like a prophecy. January 1985, the Miami Dolphins faced the San Francisco 49ers in Super Bowl XXX, a clash seen as a battle of two worlds. Marino, the young whirlwind of the future, versus Joe Montana, the calm master of the present. All of America turned its eyes to Palo Alto. Before kickoff, Marino stood in the tunnel, the roar of the crowd like an earthquake. He looked up at California's clear sky and whispered, "This is the moment I was born for." But fate doesn't favor those who peak too soon. In the first half, the 49ers defense smothered every pass. Montana played like an emotionless machine, and Miami was swept into a maelstrom of defeat. Each time the ball left Marino's hand, it flew like a desperate spark, fast, strong, but never reaching its mark. When the fourth quarter ended, the scoreboard read 38-16 for San Francisco. Marino stood frozen, staring at the screen, his breath heavy. Reporters rushed over, thrusting microphones. "How does it feel to reach your first Super Bowl and lose?" He only said, "We'll be back." But deep down he knew he was lying, not from lack of belief, but from an indescribable feeling, as if fate had slammed that door shut the moment it opened. In the locker room, the sound of shower water mixed with sighs. A few teammates patted his shoulder, but Marino didn't respond. He sat there, head bowed, large hands covering his face, a sweat-soaked white towel draped around his neck. I touched heaven, he thought, and was burned right there. As he left the field, hundreds of camera flashes blinded him, forcing him to squint. It was like a storm of light swallowing the young man, the light of fame, expectation, and emptiness. In the months that followed, every newspaper hailed him as the NFL's future. Ad deals, TV invites and awards poured in, but behind the door of his Miami apartment, Marino sat alone, replaying the Super Bowl on TV, pausing at every errant throw. If I'd snapped my wrist faster, if I'd looked left before throwing, he muttered to himself, obsessed. The arm that awed the world now felt like a traitor in his eyes. Family said he didn't sleep those nights. The sound of ocean waves mixed with the hum of the projector as he reviewed game tapes. He was haunted, a teammate said. He couldn't stand the thought of failing at the peak. Even when awarded MVP, he accepted it with a somber face. At the ceremony, as the crowd stood and clapped, Marino forced a smile. To them it was a triumph. To him it was a requiem for something that died inside, the innocence of youth. Glory came too fast, and with it immense pressure. Marino began to fear praise. Each compliment made him dread he couldn't repeat it. I felt trapped in the light, he said years later. The brighter it got, the darker I felt. He lived in a cruel paradox. The more he was celebrated, the lonelier he became. The 1984 season was called the Meteor Year, the year of the shooting star. Marino had blazed, lighting up the NFL sky, but like all shooting stars, he burned too fast, too soon, leaving only embers falling silently in the dark of fate. From then on, every time he stepped onto the field, he carried a hidden fear. If the first peak was also the only one, then everything after would be a desperate attempt to recreate the impossible. And indeed, in the years that followed, he never touched that light again. But 1984 lived on, not just as a season of records, but as the season that stole Dan Marino's most precious belief, that glory could bring happiness. The years after 1984 became what people called the curse of greatness, a stretch of time where he reached every statistical peak, but never the pinnacle of fate. From 1985 to the late 1990s, the Miami Dolphins remained his team, and he was their heart. Every Sunday, tens of thousands filled the stands, believing this would be the year, that this winter would be Dan's. But each year, as cold winds blew in, the dream dissolved like steam rising from the ice bath, where he sat after games alone, shoulders pressed against the wall, eyes staring into the distance. His arm still threw thousands of yards, his passes still cut like knives, but the outcome never changed. Playoffs came and went, titles slipped away like Miami's tropical rains, rushing in, then vanishing, leaving searing heat. Year after year, Marino broke record after record, 9 Pro Bowls, 61,361 yards, 420 touchdowns. But each season's end marked the locker room wall with an invisible crack, a new grave of hope. As one reporter put it, teammates came and went, familiar faces, Clayton, Duper, Offerdahl, retired or moved to other teams. Coach Don Shula, who led Miami to the Super Bowl and the perfect season of 1972, began to age, his steps slower on the sideline. Shula's final years were filled with unease. He had a legend in his hands, but no team to turn that legend into a champion. When Shula left in 1995, Marino sat in the office, watching him walk out, silent. Later he admitted, "The day he left, I understood what it means for an empire to die quietly." The American media began to shift its tone. From Dan the Man, they turned to the cursed arm of Miami. A Sports Illustrated editorial wrote, "Marino is cursed, brilliant but doomed. The gods gave him the arm of Apollo, but denied him the ring of kings." He read the article in a hotel room, letting out a laugh, but it was a dry, hollow laugh, devoid of warmth. That night, he turned off the light, soaked in an ice bath, staring at the ceiling. The clamor of Miami's city life echoed through the window, mingling with the fizz of bubbles by his ears. There no one cheered, no commentator spoke, only the slow heartbeat of a man trying to convince himself that numbers still meant something. As he aged, Marino grew more isolated. Younger players called him the old wolf, half in respect, half in distance. They saw him as a living legend, but none truly understood the man behind the number 13 jersey. After each loss, he faced the cameras, flashed a smile, and said, "We'll be back." But when the cameras turned off, he sat in the locker room, slowly unwrapping his knee tape, hands trembling slightly. Many said Marino never cried, but an old teammate recalled seeing him sit silently for hours, his eyes cloudy like a lake after a storm. Some nights, Miami didn't sleep, and neither could he. He watched game tapes, rewinding failed throws, passes off by mere inches. "If I'd thrown lower, if the receiver had run faster," he whispered, haunted. Perfection, once his ally, had become his tormentor. He was obsessed with his own greatness. A coach said, "No one could bear Dan's gaze after a loss. It didn't blame, but it made you feel you'd betrayed something sacred." In 1992, Miami reached deep into the playoffs, only to fall again to Jim Kelly's Buffalo Bills. Kelly, from the same draft class. When the whistle blew, Kelly ran over, hugged him, and said, "You deserve a ring more than I do." Marino smiled, but his eyes were wet. "No, you won, Jim. That says it all." Then he walked straight into the tunnel, head bowed. The light behind him spread, then faded. The 90s passed like a slow-motion film. Each year the Miami Dolphins brought new hope, and each year it died young. Marino remained, still the center of every storm, standing tall amid roaring stands. But his smiles grew rare. Fans began to pity more than admire. They cheered each throw, then fell silent when the team lost. In that silence was something like shared sorrow, unspoken, but understood by all. The ring would never come. One evening in 1997, after a playoff loss, Marino sat in the locker room, wrist taped, shoulder patched with ice. The lights dimmed, leaving only the faint blue glow of a TV screen. A young staffer entered to clean, saw him still sitting, silent. "You okay, Dan?" he asked. Marino looked up, gave a weak smile. "I'm fine, just winter came early this year." The staffer didn't understand, but later said, when he said that, it felt like hearing someone who'd just buried something important. By the end of his career, people stopped asking Marino about stats, and started asking about pain. A reporter once asked, "Do you think you're cursed?" Marino replied, "If being cursed is loving something your whole life even when it never loves you back, then maybe I am." The room fell silent. The world saw his glory, but only he knew its cost. Nights soaking in cold water to dull the burning in his shoulder, springs watching teammates lift trophies while he clapped from the stands. That applause, meant to honor others, echoed the loneliness he heard in his own heart. The curse of greatness wasn't in failure, but in living forever with unfulfilled expectations. And each year, as Miami's sea breeze carried the scent of salt, Dan Marino still heard a familiar sound, not cheers, but the hollow echo of ringless winters. October 1993, a game between the Miami Dolphins and Cleveland Browns unfolded under Florida's blazing sun. Joe Robbie Stadium was ablaze, fans roaring as Marino took the field, same bright eyes, half smile, and throwing form that commanded the NFL's respect. Miami led the division, the season looking like a path back to the top, but fate, as always, waited in the shadows to test the proudest. In the second quarter, after a perfect fake handoff, Marino stepped back 3 paces, eyes scanning the field. He saw an opening, poised to release the ball. Then in an instant, a sharp pop rang out, stark and chilling. The sound was small but enough to bury a season. The crowd fell silent. Marino collapsed, clutching his right leg, face pale. His eyes widened, not from pain, but from fear. He knew that pop was the end for any player, a torn Achilles. No throw could save that tendon. As the medical team rushed in, he shook his head, tried to stand, but his right leg gave out. Leaving the field, he bowed his head, hand covering his face, as fans stood clapping, some crying. But Marino heard only the wind whistling past his ears. For a moment Florida's light turned blinding white, then faded, as if the world had drained its color. Surgery followed immediately. 6 hours on the operating table, and when he woke, his leg was encased in a rigid cast from knee to heel. The doctor whispered, "You'll need at least 6 months, and no one can guarantee you'll return." Marino nodded, silent. When everyone left, he turned to the wall, tears falling quietly. "I was afraid I'd never throw again," he wrote in his journal later. For others it was an injury. For him it was the loss of his soul. The early days of recovery were hell. His right foot wouldn't move, muscles atrophied. Marino, once steady as a bronze statue, had to relearn how to walk. In the therapy room, he practiced small motions, bending his leg, flexing muscles, relaxing. Pain brought sweat-soaked bandages. Some days after everyone left the center, he stayed, gripping handrails, trying to lift his leg, then collapsing to the floor. A doctor recalled, "I walked in, saw him lying there, silent, staring at the ceiling. I thought he was praying." America sympathized, but no one grasped his inner nightmare. From a gridiron god, Marino became a man with wooden crutches, shuffling slowly through hospital halls. In the mirror, he saw himself age decades in a moment. The confident gaze gave way to vague fear, the dread that the world would forget him. "It's strange," he said. "I wasn't afraid of pain, just of no one calling my name on weekends." Don Shula, his coach and mentor, visited weekly. He offered no comforting words, just sat down, placing a football on the table. "You'll throw again," Shula said. "Not for them, for you." Marino looked at the ball, gripped it, felt its rough leather, and broke down. In that cold white room, the sound was like a confession from a man who once believed he was immortal. 6 months passed in the smell of antiseptic, bandages, and sweat. Marino refused to sit out the season entirely. He began rehab early, wearing a steel brace, taking slow steps across an empty practice field. When teammates left, he threw with an assistant, short, light passes, still laced with the anger of a man felled by fate. Once I saw him standing alone on the field, wind blowing, yellow lights glowing, throwing into the void. For 15 minutes, like he was talking to himself, a teammate recalled. The day he returned to the field, Miami erupted. 60,000 people stood as he emerged from the tunnel. Cheers thundered, banners raised high. "Welcome back, Dan." He smiled, waved, but the smile held a quiet weight. When his first throw left his hand, the stands exploded. But only he knew his right foot still ached dully, every step a sharp sting. Retreating to the sideline, he soaked his foot in ice, head bowed, silent. At night he didn't sleep, staring at the ceiling, wondering, "I'm back, but am I still me?" Though his performance remained impressive, the light in his eyes had changed. The bold, defiant confidence of years past now hid behind a fog of wariness. When a reporter asked how it felt to return, he said only, "I'm lucky to walk again," then turned away. No one saw that. On that day, Marino lost something fame couldn't replace, faith in his own immortality. Later, in a rare interview, he said, "I thought I'd beaten fate, but really, I just survived it." Those words held the rawest truth about the man who once stood atop the world. When the body shatters, the soul cracks too. And though he returned, won, set records, it was all just his way of fighting fear, the fear that one day that Pop would return, not in his leg, but in his heart. The 1993 fall didn't just tear Marino's Achilles, it ripped through the veil of pride, exposing the fragile, lonely, wounded man beneath. But from that wreckage, a new resolve was born. He no longer threw to be admired, but to prove pain could become strength. When Miami's lights blazed again, and fans chanted his name, Marino smiled, but inside, he knew every throw now wasn't just for yards, but to keep his heart beating. The 1994 season opened like a symphony of pain and rebirth. Dan Marino returned from his Achilles injury, not as fast, not as agile, but with an arm still like a god's weapon. When the ball left his hand, it flew in perfect arcs, needing no body, only will. They said, he throws with his soul, not his feet. Each pass was a declaration, "I'm still here." That season, Marino led the league in passing yards again. In one game he threw over 450 yards, as if proving a torn Achilles couldn't kill a Warrior's heart. The stands roared. Miami swept up in Dan Marino fever again. But deep down he knew, football is a game of 53 men, and one arm, no matter how great, couldn't save a team. That Dolphins team lacked defense, lacked depth. They won epic games, then lost inexplicably. Marino fought on, throwing until his shoulder burned, wrist swollen, but each victory felt temporary, a patch on a cracked soul. New teammates came and went, coaches shifted philosophies, yet he remained, steadfast as a sentinel for the city. After a bitter loss, a reporter asked, "Do you think Miami will reach the Super Bowl again?" Marino paused long, then said softly, "I think they deserve it. I'm not sure I have enough left to lead them all the way." It wasn't weakness, but the voice of a man who knew he'd given so much there was little left to hold back. In the years that followed, the Dolphins lingered on the edge of glory. Marino kept breaking records, yards, touchdowns, wins, but the Super Bowl ring remained elusive, a phantom. Each season, the media revisited the old question, can Dan Marino complete his legacy without a title? He just smiled. "I don't know, maybe the title doesn't need me, but Miami does." 1999, his final season. His body was no longer an athlete's, but a man's battling time, shoulder aching, knees swollen, hands numb after each throw. Yet he took the field, throwing one more time for the team, the fans, himself. Miami reached the playoffs, but fell disastrously to the Jacksonville Jaguars, 62-7, the worst loss of Marino's career. When the game ended, he walked off, head low, no complaints, no tears, just the distant gaze of a man bidding farewell to the best part of his life. Soon after, he announced his retirement. America was stunned, but for him it was inevitable. The farewell press conference in Miami drew hundreds of reporters. Asked about his greatest regret, he said, "I gave Miami everything but not what they wanted most." The room fell silent. Amid flashing cameras, Marino's eyes glistened, but his smile held. He didn't speak of failure, but of love. In 2000, his #13 jersey was raised to the rafters of Hard Rock Stadium, then pro player. Miami was awash in emotion. Thousands attended, millions watched on TV. As the banner with the number 13 rose, fans chanted, "Dan, Dan, Dan." He stood on the field, hair flecked with gray, hand raised to the crowd, a gentle smile, but cloudy eyes. Beneath that banner, the man who never won a title was honored like a king. A commentator said, "We're witnessing the greatest paradox in sports, celebrating a man who never won." Marino heard it and smiled. In that moment, he felt the truth. Glory wasn't the Lombardi trophy, but the hearts that beat with his for nearly 2 decades. He knew the ring might never come, but Miami was his forever. As the ceremony ended, the stadium lights dimmed, leaving only a faint glow on his face. In that moment, there was a beautiful sadness, a peace tinged with longing. The man who'd run his whole life for victory stood there no longer rushing. The arm that threw thousands of passes hung loose at his side, his eyes fixed on the banner fluttering lightly in the breeze. "I gave Miami everything," he thought, "and maybe that's enough." In the stands people cried, shouted, sang, "You'll never walk alone." But in his mind, there was only the wind across the field, the familiar sound of solitude. For despite all the love, he alone knew the cost of greatness, standing amid a cheering sea, yet hearing the void in his heart no one could fill, glory and solitude. As he left the field that day, Dan Marino looked back one last time. The light reflected off the number 13 banner, radiant as the sun, a sun that never sets and never warms. In the early 2000s, after the stadium lights faded, Dan Marino entered a different world, smaller, quieter, but fiercer than any game. No more 60,000 chanting his name, no whistle to start play, just a house in Weston, Florida, where the man once deemed immortal learned to be human again. There was Claire, the woman by his side since his early career, and their 6 children, raised with love and everyday worries. But one child brought him to his knees, not for glory, but for helplessness. His second son, Michael. At 3, Claire noticed Michael was different. He spoke little, avoided eye contact, and spent hours spinning toy wheels. Marino, still basking in NFL glory, thought it was a phase. But one night, a doctor whispered, "Michael has autism." The world around him collapsed. Marino sat frozen in a chair. Claire cried, but he couldn't speak. In years facing countless games, he'd never been afraid. But that night, fear flooded his heart like an unstoppable storm. "I'd faced every kind of failure," he said later, "but nothing prepared me for that moment." That night, as the house slept, Marino stepped onto the porch, sitting still under a dim yellow light. The breeze carried Miami's salty sea scent, and he realized he was crying, not for lost fame, but for the first time feeling utterly powerless. The arm that threw thousands of yards trembled as it reached for his son's tiny hand, but Michael didn't respond. Instead of breaking, Marino chose to fight, not on the field, but against fate. He devoured every book on autism, attended therapy classes, spoke with doctors, experts, parents. In 1992, amid his blazing career, he founded the Dan Marino Foundation, a nonprofit for children with neurodevelopmental disorders. "I can't change the world," he said, "but I can change one child's world." Every week, he spent time at the therapy center, where children who couldn't speak, couldn't communicate, still smiled when they saw him walk in. People say that once, Marino took off his shoes, sat on the floor to play with blocks alongside the kids, while their parents watched through the window and cried. A staffer said, "He was once a symbol of strength, but here he's a symbol of gentleness." But the greatest miracle happened in a small room in their own home. One afternoon, Claire called him into the therapy room. Michael, then 7, was sitting in a chair, hands trembling. The therapist said, "Place your hand on his." Marino hesitated, then knelt down, touching that hand. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then suddenly, Michael squeezed lightly. Marino froze. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. The son he thought he'd never reach had just held on to him. Tears fell, warm and real. "That was the most important touchdown of my life," he said later, voice choking. From that moment, everything changed. Marino was no longer haunted by games, by numbers. He found new meaning, not on the field, but in the eyes of a child once locked in his own world. Claire said, "Before he lived to throw the ball, now he lives to touch hearts." Marino began using his fame to raise autism awareness. He fundraised, sponsored research, built a rehabilitation center named after his son, the Marino Campus, where autistic youth received vocational training and life skills. "Without Michael," he said, "I'd never understand what silent miracles are." People often saw him at charity events, no longer in fancy suits, but in simple shirts, arm around each child, smiling kindly. When asked if he missed the field, he replied, "I'm still competing, just on a quieter field now." One late night, Claire recalled an image she'd never forget. "That day, I woke up in the middle of the night, and saw the hallway lights still on. I walked out, and saw Dan in Michael's room, reading a story to him. Michael said nothing, just looked at him, and Dan kept reading, until the boy fell asleep. Then he sat there, silent, holding his hand, staring out the window. Outside, rain fell softly on the roof tiles. In that small room, the man who once shook America was just a father, voice hoarse from rereading an old story. No audience, no scoreboard, just the breath of father and son blending together. There in the gentle darkness, Dan Marino finally won, not against opponents, but against his own loneliness. Later, when asked about the most beautiful moment of his life, he didn't mention the Super Bowl, didn't mention records, but simply answered, "It was when the kid held my hand for the first time." Now in the Florida home, walls covered with family photos, shelves holding faded silver trophies, but in the middle of it all, a small picture, Michael smiling, and Dan leaning down, hand on his son's shoulder. The light in the photo is soft, as if time itself bowed its head. People once called him a cursed genius, a king without a throne. But if you look into that quiet home, where small miracles happen every day, you'll understand that the curse had turned into a blessing. Because sometimes God doesn't give us the championship ring, He gives us tiny hands to hold, to know that love, even silent, is the greatest victory. 2013. Amid the blazing lights of Super Bowl XXI, where old legends were invited back to the stage for honors, Dan Marino's name rang out again, but this time, not for records or loyalty, but for something else, something America never thought would attach to him: scandal. The news exploded like a storm. Dan Marino has a love child with a CBS employee. The press used shockwave, a jolt shaking American sports. Papers that once called him an icon of integrity now ran bold headlines: "The perfect man imperfect." In hours, the reputation he'd built over 30 years crumbled like sand under waves. In Miami, where he was once revered as a saint, people whispered in bars, on radio shows, by the docks, "He's just human," some said. But others were harsher: "We believed he was the ideal man." Turns out it was just an illusion. Reporters swarmed his home, flashes lighting the gate, and amid the chaos, Marino stepped out, stood tall, voice hoarse: "This is my fault, no one else's. I hurt the people I love, and I'll take responsibility." Those words offered no excuses, no blame shifting. It was like a straight, clean, precise throw, but this time, aimed at his own heart. Claire, his wife of over 30 years, said nothing. No public anger, no tears. She simply withdrew from the spotlight, held the kids, and let her husband face the fallout. When a reporter asked if she'd leave, Claire said only, "That's our business. This family still stands." A short statement, stronger than any defense. That night, the house was unnaturally quiet. Marino came home late, took off his coat, looked around the familiar living room. The family photos still on the shelf, Michael's drawing still on the wall, but the air felt thick, heavy. He went to the bathroom, turned on the light. The cold white glow reflected a face once adored by millions, now tired, older than his years. He stared into the mirror for a long time, like looking at a stranger. In the silence, he whispered, "I threw thousands of yards accurately, except the one throw in life, the one into someone else's heart." His eyes reddened. For the first time in years, Dan Marino, the man who stood firm against every storm of criticism, felt small. No longer a legend, no longer an exemplary father, no longer the moral icon America worshipped. Just a man lost in his own image. He sat on the edge of the sink, head bowed low, hands trembling. In the darkness, every cheer from the past turned into a hollow echo. The next day, old friends avoided him. Some in the media paused collaborations. EBS, where he was an analyst, issued a cold statement: "We respect Dan Marino's privacy." Behind those words was an invisible, sharp, chilling distance. Many expected him to fight back, to protect his image. But he did nothing. He stayed silent. No lawsuits, no rebuttals, no explanations. He just did what few expected. Called Claire, said softly, "I'm sorry, not just for that, but for making you ashamed of me." Claire was quiet for a few seconds, then replied, "Come home. Michael's still waiting for you to read to him." That was all, and Marino broke down. In that instant, he understood that love, the thing he'd once feared and avoided, was the only thing that could save him. In the weeks that followed, he all but vanished from the media. No events, no statements, no sports commentary. He stayed home, cooked, drove the kids to school, watched movies with his wife, and every night, still read to Michael. A close friend recalled, "Dan told me he'd never been afraid on stage, but the first time he walked into the living room to face his family after it all, he was truly shaking." Time doesn't erase mistakes, but it allows a person to rediscover their humanity. For Marino, redemption wasn't in words, but in actions. He expanded the Dan Marino Foundation, adding programs to support women and children in special circumstances. He anonymously funded organizations helping single mothers, a fact unknown until years later, when a local paper revealed a man who didn't need forgiveness still wanted to help others stand up. And then something strange happened. The public, once harsh with its idols, began to empathize. Perhaps they saw that in his fall, Dan Marino seemed real for the first time. No longer a gleaming bronze statue on the field, but a flesh and blood man, with mistakes, tears, and efforts to make amends. A year later, in a rare TV appearance, the host asked, "Do you regret it?" Marino paused, eyes downcast. "Yes, but not for loving wrongly. I regret letting pride make me forget the most important thing, honesty with those I love. The room fell silent, and when he smiled, there was something different, not the glow of glory, but the gentle weariness of a man who'd fallen and learned to rise. That night, back home, he passed through the hallway, seeing Claire tucking in Michael. The dim light fell on the two most important people in his life. Marino stopped, leaned against the wall, silent. He was no longer Miami's king, no longer a symbol of perfection, just a man who'd lost his way but was allowed to return. In the soft breeze through the window, he whispered, "Thank God, at least I still get to come home." The night passed in peace, and in that small room, where the desk lamp cast light on a face that once made America roar, there was only stillness, the stillness of a soul, gazing into an old mirror, seeing clearly all that was lost, and realizing the one thing left, love, fragile as it was the only thing strong enough to forgive a man. In 2008, Miami was drenched in days of relentless rain, as if the sky carried the sorrow of a son who'd lost his father. Daniel Marino Sr., the man who drove a delivery truck through Pittsburgh winters, the stoic, silent figure, passed away quietly. The news of his father's death reached Dan during a Dan Marino Foundation charity event. Amid applause, his phone buzzed, a brief message. "He's gone." Marino stood frozen, all sound vanished, flashes, music, congratulations, meaningless in that moment. At the funeral, Pittsburgh was cloaked in snowy rain. Marino returned to the old street, where he'd thrown a ball against a red brick wall behind the house. The alley remained, but his father was gone. As the casket entered St. Regis Church, Dan walked among crowded pews. Familiar faces, friends, fans, all watched the Miami legend, now just a son trying to hide red eyes. When the priest invited him to speak, Marino shook his head. He couldn't. Instead, he approached the casket, placing an old leather football on it, the kind he used at 14 when his father watched from the fence. No words, just a simple, painful act. After the ceremony, he sat alone in his car, watching rain streak the windshield. "My father never said he was proud of me," he whispered, "but I think today maybe he knows." Tears fell, mingling with the rain. This wasn't the unbreakable man who'd toppled defenses, but the boy from a steel town, still longing for an embrace that never came. 12 years later, fate took his second father. Don Shula, the legendary coach, died in 2020 at 90. When the news broke, the Miami Dolphins flew their flag at half-mast. The city hushed. To Miami, Shula was the maker of legends. To Marino, he was the man who gave a kid rejected by 26 teams a chance to find his worth. The funeral was small, held amid the COVID-19 pandemic, under rain. Marino stood silently in the front row, masked, silver hair fluttering in the wind. He said nothing, gave no interviews, just stared at Shula's portrait on the altar. When his turn came, he stepped forward, pulling from his coat another old leather ball, a Wilson, like the one Shula gave him in 1983 at their first practice. He placed it gently on the casket, hands trembling. No farewell words, just a slight nod, as if saying what he never could. "Thank you, coach, for believing in me when no one did." After the ceremony, he lingered longer than anyone. Wind whipped his coat, rain soaked the stone ground, drenching his shoulders. Passers-by saw him standing alone under the gray sky, head bowed. A cemetery worker recalled, "He stood there nearly half an hour, unmoving. I couldn't hear, but it seemed he was talking to someone, or himself." Perhaps in that rain, Marino was bidding farewell to the last of his youth, to the two fathers who forged him with silence and discipline. Leaving the cemetery, he looked back, two graves half a continent apart, one in Pittsburgh, one in Miami, his soul split in two. On the flight back to Florida, Marino gazed out the window at gray clouds blanketing the sky, a hollow feeling creeping into his chest. Both fathers are gone, he thought, and I have no one left to lean on. That night, at home, he sat on the porch, listening to distant waves. Claire stepped out, placed a hand on his shoulder, asked softly, "You okay?" He nodded but didn't speak. Inside, something collapsed, not from death, but from realizing he was the last of that generation. No one left to guide, to scold, to teach. He was the father the mentor, the icon, but no one remained to father him. The next day, he visited the Dolphins training facility, where a bronze statue of Don Shula was being erected. Marino stood silently, watching. The statue showed Shula holding up one finger, the symbol of victory. Marino gave a faint smile, but his glistening eyes held an ocean of memories. Late-night strategy sessions, Shula slamming clipboards, chewing him out for a bad pass. He was the only one who dared tell me I wasn't good enough, Marino thought, and maybe the only one who made me want to be better. That afternoon, rain fell again. He drove home alone, playing an old Shula interview on the radio. The coach's voice rang out. Dan was the greatest player I ever coached. But what made me proudest wasn't the yards or titles, it was how he never gave up. Marino listened, bit his lip. At the end he turned off the radio, leaving only the rain's rhythm on the windshield. Night fell, the house quiet. He walked through the hallway, passing a photo of his father and Shula framed together, two men who shaped him, now mere shadows. He sat, touching the frame lightly, eyes closing. In that moment, Dan Marino was no legend, no icon, just the boy from Pittsburgh, standing in fog, longing for a "I'm proud of you." Outside, thunder rumbled. He opened the window, watching rain pour, cold drops splashing in. On the table, two old footballs sat side by side, one for the father who gave him life, one for the father who taught him to live. Between them, a man sat alone, as if trapped between two worlds, glory and loss, light and shadow, son and father, and in the steady rain, only a whisper dissolved into the night. If I could, I just want to hear it once, that I was good enough. In 2007, during a routine checkup, the doctor studied the blood test results, then looked up, eyes graver than ever. He spoke slowly, deliberately. Dan, your liver's in trouble, signs of MASH, fatty liver turning to inflammation. Marino sat still, not grasping it immediately. Minutes earlier, he'd been joking with a nurse about his weight, but now, those words echoed like an alarm. It's not something to take lightly, the doctor added. It's silent, no immediate pain, but it can kill you in the slowest way. He nodded, left, told no one. At home, he looked in the mirror, face still healthy, Florida tanned skin, no sign of illness. But inside, a new fear crept in, one he'd never faced, even on the field, fear of weakness. For a man who symbolized strength, weak was unthinkable. From then on, he hid the illness, not from his wife, friends, or colleagues. He kept appearing on TV, at charity events, with his bright smile and proud stance. Only Claire noticed something off nights when Marino stayed awake, pacing the living room, hand on his stomach, face wincing. "You okay?" she asked. He only replied, "Just can't sleep." But insomnia wasn't the only issue. His body began to rebel, dull pains under his right ribs, a heavy feeling after meals, mornings waking with slightly yellowed skin and dark circles under his eyes. Once, while holding a coffee mug, his hand trembled slightly. He forced a laugh, set it down, hid it. But in his mind, the doctor's words echoed like a curse. If you don't control it, you could lose liver function. He lived like that for nearly 2 decades, between glory and fear. Each time he took the stage, the lights made his skin glow yellow, but audiences thought it was just the spotlight. Each time he signed autographs, his hand shook faintly, but people assumed it was emotion. He maintained the image of Dan the man, unyielding, strong, never falling. In reality, inside that body, every cell fought a silent battle, like an endless playoff game. Claire recounted, "Some nights I woke up and found him in the kitchen, a small light casting shadows on his sweat-drenched face. I asked, he said it was just couldn't sleep. But I saw his eyes, not tired, but afraid." Marino hid his illness to avoid pity. He once told a close friend, "The world called me strong my whole life. I can't let them see me weaken." But by 2025, at 64, he couldn't hide anymore. The pains grew frequent. One morning, preparing for an interview, he suddenly felt dizzy and collapsed by the sink. Claire rushed him to the hospital, panicked. After stabilizing, the doctor said, "You can't stay silent anymore. The disease has progressed." For the first time, he faced the truth. The body that once threw 70-yard passes now trembled, holding a glass of water. And for the first time, Dan Marino publicly admitted his weakness. In a CBS interview, where his scandal broke a decade earlier, he appeared weary, voice low. "I hid my illness for nearly 20 years, he said, because I was afraid. Afraid the public would think their hero was old, weak. But the truth is, we all weaken, and if I don't speak, I'll die in silence." America's audience fell silent. A generation raised on Marino raising his arm to throw now, saw him place a trembling hand on the table, breathing slowly. "I used to hear tens of thousands cheer when I touched the ball," he said, "and now, I hear the heart monitor. They're different sounds, but both are the sound of life." The studio was deathly quiet. From that day he became a face for chronic liver disease awareness. He no longer shunned the spotlight, but used it to illuminate what others feared to say. On TV, he spoke of sleepless nights, needle-like pains, and moments when his hand shook signing for fans. "I used to think strength was never falling," he said, "but now I know strength is daring to stand when no one's clapping anymore." At home, life slowed. He followed a strict diet, light exercise, regular sleep. Each morning, he sat on the porch watching sunlight hit the lake, hearing birds, joking with Claire, "I'm not dead yet, so I win another day." She smiled, but her eyes held unhidden worry. One night Michael walked in, saw his father sitting with a heart monitor. "What are you listening to, Dad?" he asked. Marino smiled. "The old stadium crowd, son. Each beep is an old fan cheering me to keep living." Michael laughed, sat beside him. Father and son listened together, the small machine's steady beeps, like the heartbeat of memories. For others, illness is an end. For Marino, it was a quiet beginning, a beginning of letting go, accepting that glory must yield to time. "My body's not strong anymore," he wrote in his journal, "but my heart's still strong enough to be grateful." Sometimes Claire caught him looking at the backyard, where he'd set up a small goalpost. He'd throw a few balls, light, slow, each a gentle farewell to the man he was. Afternoon light reflected off sweat, glistening like tears. At 64, Dan Marino no longer fought to win, but to survive. So each breath, each heartbeat, each monitor's beep, proved something simple yet profound. Even as the body crumbled, the warrior's soul never surrendered. After revealing his illness, Dan Marino slowly returned to the public, not as an invincible legend, but as a man who'd weathered storms. CBS invited him back to the NFL Today desk, where he'd sat through the 2000s. On air, his voice was still warm, fluid as ever, but his eyes were different, a distant gaze, as if standing between two worlds, the present and the stadiums, where he was once Dan the Man. When cameras zoomed in, keen viewers noticed him pause a beat longer, not from forgetting lines, but from memories intruding, old cheers, the thud of a ball on grass, the adrenaline surge of touching it. But now, it was all in the past. No one teaches you how to retire with a heart still beating. No one teaches you how to retire with a heart still beating for the game, he said on a live show. The studio fell silent. The man who once embodied football's brilliance now spoke with a weary but deeply human voice. Marino no longer sought thrills. He spoke less, listened more, discussing young quarterbacks, Tua Tagovailoa, Patrick Mahomes, Joe Burrow. He didn't critique, just smiled. "They have the light I once had," he said, "and they don't yet know how it'll burn." His co-host glanced over, seeing pride and pity in his eyes. One October afternoon, the Dolphins invited him to Hard Rock Stadium to honor the new generation. The sky was pale blue, a sea breeze carrying salt. He stepped onto the stands, applause crashing like waves. Young players ran to shake his hand, seek advice. Marino said only, "Enjoy it while your heart can take it. One day the cheers will just be memories, and all you'll have left is who's standing beside you." As the game began, he sat in the honorary seats, watching the aqua-clad youngsters. Each throw pulled him back to 1984, when he stood there, gazing at Florida's sky, believing he'd conquer the world. He recognized their stride, their arms, their eyes, a reflection of his youth. But now, his heart held not ambition, but a tender weariness. When the Dolphins scored a touchdown, the stands erupted. Marino stood, clapped, hands trembling slightly. He smiled, sat back down, eyes drifting to the sideline where young players hugged in celebration. I was them once, he said softly, and one day they'll be me. That night, he spoke at a Dan Marino Foundation gala. The lights were soft, the mood elegant yet somber. Taking the mic, he hesitated a few seconds, then said, "They teach you how to win, how to rise, how to face failure. But no one teaches you how to let go of something your heart still beats for. When I left the field, I thought I'd retired from the game. But over these 20 years, I learned you can't truly leave football when it's part of your blood." The room was silent. Some wiped tears. He bowed his head, voice hoarse. "If there's one thing I want to tell the kids growing up in Miami, it's this: love the game, but don't let it take your whole soul like it took mine." Returning home, he walked the long stadium hallway. Lights were off, only a few glowing faintly. On the walls hung old photos. Marino raising the ball, smiling, throwing a fateful pass. He stopped before one from 1984. Young face, eyes ablaze. He touched the glass lightly, as if touching an old soul. The night breeze swept through empty stands, carrying faint echoes of the past. In the dark he heard, "Dan, Dan." Unclear from where, perhaps just a trick of the mind, but he smiled. "I know you're still there," he whispered, "and I'm still here just on the other side of the echo." As he stepped into the parking lot, he looked back at the stadium one last time. That place, once a cathedral, a battlefield, a home, was now just a silent dome reflecting moonlight. Dan Marino took a deep breath, then said softly, "I lived fully here, and maybe the rest of me will always stay here." The Florida night was still. The distant crash of waves blended with the breeze through empty stands, like a lullaby for a lost era. The man once a symbol of strength walked slowly, his figure merging into the darkness, a soul of the gridiron, returning to the stands not to watch a game, but to hear his heartbeat echo in the silence. One June night in 2025, Dan Marino sat alone in his Weston study. A breeze through the window carried the salty damp of the sea. On the desk, among relics of a lifetime, an old Dolphins helmet, leather gloves, a photo with Don Shula, was the emptiest thing, a ringless fourth finger. He stared at his hand for a long time, then picked up a pen. The paper before him bore only a title, "Dear Ring to the Ring That Never Was." He began writing, as if speaking to a distant friend, an obsession that had lived with him for 40 years. "You, they say, only by touching you does a player become a true legend. I believed that. I lived, breathed, and ached for you. Every spring I thought, maybe this year you'll come, but you never did." He paused, a faint smile, then continued, "I thought I'd hold you on the field, raise you amid fireworks. I imagined the feel of it so much I could hear metal against skin, but looking back, maybe if I'd touched you, I wouldn't be me anymore." Outside rain pattered, the desk lamp casting light on a face etched by time. In his eyes, no bitterness, only a gentle peace tinged with regret. He wrote, "You know, I once ran from the truth that my life wouldn't have you. I threw myself into practice, threw until my shoulder tore, eyes blurred, heart hurt. I believed winning would heal every wound, but then without you, I learned something else: you don't need to win to be whole." He set the pen down, hand trembling slightly. At 64 his liver disease left him weary, but his hands still carried the memory of throws that never faded. On the wall, a TV screen displayed the 2000 ceremony when his number 13 was raised. The circular stands glowed like a halo. He looked and whispered, "That's a ring of its own, isn't it?" Then he wrote on, letters shaky but firm, "You don't know, but I found other rings in life. My son's small arms when he first held my hand in therapy, that was the warmest ring I ever wore. The wheelchair's wheels in rehab after my Achilles tore, they turned slowly, painfully, but each spin reminded me I was alive. And then the Hard Rock Stadium stands the night they honored me, tens of thousands stood, forming a circle of light around me. You weren't there, but I knew I was surrounded by something greater than you love." Between the lines, memories surfaced, Don Shula's stern gaze, his father in Pittsburgh, Claire's laugh, Michael's hand touching his for the first time. Each memory, a piece in an invisible chain of rings, gifts life gave instead of the one he never wore. He wrote again, "They call me the greatest who never won." I used to hate that phrase, it felt like a wound reopened. But now I understand not winning kept me hungry. Without you, I learned to love the journey more than the destination. Failure kept me humble, and you taught me that what we don't touch sometimes makes us truly live. Ink smudged as a tear fell, Marino chuckled softly. Not a tragic laugh, but one of realization. He stood, walked to the window. Outside, Miami's city lights reflected on the water, tiny glints spinning like thousands of rings. He said softly, "Maybe you never came because you were already everywhere." Back at the desk he continued, "You were my beginning and my final lesson. I spent my youth chasing you, but in the end you showed me not all glory is measured in metal and jewels. A hug, a look, a moment of forgiveness, sometimes that's the ring life meant for me." Here, he stopped, took a deep breath. A gentle breeze stirred the paper. He looked at the final line, then added one last sentence as a farewell. "If you're real, I hope you're on someone else's hand, someone younger, stronger, who still believes winning is everything. As for me, I'll stay here, smiling at the empty space on my finger, grateful you taught me that sometimes, loss is how God grants salvation." He folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, no address, placed it on the desk beside a photo from last year's fundraiser, him and Michael smiling, stage lights forming a perfect halo around them. That night, he stepped onto the porch. Florida's air was quiet, save for crickets. Sat, looked at the sky, where millions of stars formed endless circles of light. In the warm breeze he felt lighter, no resentment, no regrets. "You didn't come," he whispered, "but you made me live as if you were always there." Inside, the envelope lay under the dim lamp. No one knew if he meant to send it or keep it as a final confession, but if anyone read it, they'd understand it wasn't just a letter to a ring, but a farewell to the past, to obsession, to old definitions of glory. And on the porch, Dan Marino, the man who made America roar, sat silently, his ringless hand on his chest. His heartbeat pulsed steadily, like the stadium chants of old. Perhaps that was his final ring, the cycle of light and loss, victory and something greater, peace. Florida morning, 2025. Warm, gentle sunlight spread across the brick path to the Marino Center Rehabilitation Facility. Dan Marino, at 64, walked slowly, leaning on an amber wooden cane. His right arm bore a small bandage covering an injection site for his liver treatment, fingers trembling when he gripped. Yet his eyes, the eyes that once read a field in a split second, remained bright, calm as a morning sea. Staff paused to greet him. Young patients smiled as he passed. To them he wasn't a football legend, but the man who turned personal pain into a sanctuary for others. In the hallway, a young reporter waited, recorder in hand, bowing slightly. "Sir, at this age looking back, do you have any regrets?" Marino stopped. He didn't answer immediately. Sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating a face once broadcast millions of times, now lined with wrinkles. He smiled, voice hoarse from medication. "No, I have no regrets. I only wish I'd said I love you to my father more." The short answer rang like a bell. The reporter bowed slightly, not daring to ask more. Marino walked on, shoulders trembling slightly, but his gait still proud. Outside, sunlight filtered through palms, the breeze carrying sea scent and children's laughter from the rehab training yard. He paused there, at a small field where autistic kids learned to throw balls, run, believe in themselves. A boy fumbled with a football too big for his hands. Marino approached, sat in a chair. The boy looked up, eyes clear, unaware of who he faced. Marino smiled kindly, extended a hand. "Come on, throw it to me." The boy threw. The ball veered, landed on the grass. Marino laughed, picked it up, brushed off the dirt, and tossed it back. A slow, gentle, precise throw, like old times. The ball spun, grazed the boy's hands, fell. This time, both laughed. Simple, no stands, no commentators, no one counting yards or points, just sunlight, breeze, and a man rediscovering what he'd lost. A staff member secretly recorded that moment, and the video spread across the internet. No commentary, just the image. Legend, Dan Marino, throwing a ball to a disabled child in the morning light. A comment below the clip read, "That's the most beautiful touchdown of his life." In his final years he lived quietly. Each morning, he woke early, took his medication, did light exercises, then drove to the coast. Some days, he stopped at the grassy field outside Hard Rock Stadium, where the number 13 banner still fluttered in the wind. He didn't enter, just stood and looked. An old security guard said, he came often, just to gaze at the field. One day I asked, and he said, "I'm not here to remember, I'm here to give thanks." At home, he still wrote. On his desk, a stack of unsent letters to his father, to Coach Shula, to teammates, to himself. One letter read, "If I could go back, I'd choose this path again, even knowing it wouldn't lead to a ring, because it led me to other things, to Michael, to Claire, to kindness." His liver disease tormented him, causing sleeplessness, fatigue, and occasional hospital stays for IV drips. But he didn't complain. He told his doctor, "Pain just reminds me I'm still alive." In therapy sessions, he encouraged other patients, sharing old stories with humor. "You know, I used to throw 70 yards. Now if I can toss a pillow onto the bed, I'm a champion." The room laughed, and he smiled quietly, the smile of a man who'd learned to lose without losing faith. In February 2025, the Dolphins held a tribute to Don Shula and honored their legends. Marino appeared, walking slowly onto the field. The stands rose. They chanted his name, not for records, but for resilience. When the MC invited him to speak, he held the mic, looked around, and said softly, "I used to think winning meant lifting a trophy. Now I know real victory is choosing to stand, even when no one's clapping." The words silenced the stadium, then sparked the longest applause of the night. In that moment, the man once called the greatest without a ring, won what no ring could give, absolute respect. As the ceremony ended, he didn't linger backstage. He walked quietly to the field, where the lights were dimming. He removed his glasses, took a deep breath, letting the sea breeze run through his hair. Under the night sky, he picked up a forgotten football, spun it lightly in his hand, and threw a slow pass into the void. The ball sailed, uncaught but perfect. He watched it, whispering, "That's enough." Days later, in a final interview, the host asked, "What's your true legacy, if not a title?" Marino smiled, said, "If someone sees me and learns you can fail, and still live kindly, that's enough. I didn't leave a ring, I left a lesson." Now when dusk falls on Miami, people often see him walking the shore, slow, quiet, but not alone. On his jacket, the faded Dolphins logo, its leaping dolphin still vivid, a symbol of youth, dreams and unfinished but beautiful things. On local TV, they replay the old video, Marino throwing to the boy in the therapy center, then smiling. The narrator's voice rises, deep, warm, like a farewell to an era. Sometimes, victory isn't lifting a trophy, but choosing to stand when no one's watching. Because kindness needs no spotlight, and a man's true legacy isn't in gold rings, but in how he makes the world kinder. The screen fades. Only the image remains, a silver-haired man throwing under a sunset, the ball spinning in an orange-red sky, landing softly on grass, light as a breath. No cheers, no fireworks, just the wind through Miami, carrying a simple, timeless message. A title may never come, but kindness, that's Dan Marino's final silent victory. Some stories make us cheer, others make us bow our heads. Dan Marino's journey is the latter, a eulogy for imperfect greatness that shines with humanity. From the night Hard Rock's lights dimmed with hash, 13 hanging above, to the stark pop of his Achilles in 1993, that whitened Florida's sky, Marino emerges as a hero worn by fate yet unyielding. The humiliation of draft night 1983, falling to hash 27, and the meteoric 1984, MVP at 23, then crushed by Joe Montana, set the stage for tragedy. Glory came early, peace forever late. But the deepest pain wasn't on the field. The night he admitted, "This is my fault," after the 2013 scandal, Claire's silence but staying, the funerals of his father 2008, and Don Shula 2020, where he placed old footballs on caskets without words. The 2007 MASH liver diagnosis, hidden for nearly 20 years, then revealed in 2025, with a trembling voice. I used to hear the crowd, now I hear the heart monitor. Above all, the quiet miracle, Michael's hand, his autistic son, gripping his for the first time. The most important touchdown, with no referee, only love. The letter to the ring that never came taught him, and us, about life's other rings. A son's embrace, rehab's wheelchair, the stand's halo. The lesson for America today is simple yet hard: courage to name mistakes, to apologize and forgive, redefining victory through daily kindness, speaking openly about illness, and prioritizing health, cherishing family over scoreboards. When he gently threw to a boy at the Marino Center and smiled, we understood his greatest legacy isn't a Lombardi trophy, but turning failure into compassion, a quiet, enduring victory. Thank you for joining us on Dan Marino's journey, the man who taught America that kindness outshines any title. Subscribe to our channel to keep exploring stories where victory lies, not just on the field, but in the heart of every person.